In the winter of 1939, something terrifying began happening along the frozen forests of Finland. Entire Soviet patrols were disappearing. Soldiers were found dead in the snow with single bullet wounds to their heads. No gunshots were heard. No enemy was seen. The Soviet commanders believed it was impossible until their soldiers began whispering about a ghost, a man dressed completely in white, a sniper so deadly that entire battalions feared entering the forest. The Red Army gave him a name that spread through the ranks like a curse, Belaya Smert, the White Death. By the time the war ended, this quiet Finnish farmer had become the deadliest sniper in human history. His name was Simo Häyhä, and this is the story of how one man fought an army. Before we start the chapter, please like and subscribe the Defiant Past channel. Now we go to Chapter 1, The Quiet Farmer. Long before the world knew his name, before armies feared the forests he walked through, before historians called him the deadliest sniper in history, Simo Häyhä was simply a farmer. He was born on December 17, 1905, in a small village called Rautjärvi, located in southeastern Finland. At the time, Finland itself was not even an independent nation. It was still part of the Russian Empire. Life in rural Finland during the early 20th century was harsh and demanding. Winters were brutally cold. Snow covered the land for months. Temperatures often dropped far below freezing. But the forests were rich with wildlife. For families living in small villages like Rautjärvi, hunting wasn't a sport, it was survival. Simo grew up surrounded by these forests. From the moment he was old enough to hold a rifle, he began learning the skills that would later make him legendary. Hunting required patience. It required silence. It required the ability to remain perfectly still for hours. Young Simo mastered these skills early. Neighbors described him as quiet, disciplined, and unusually focused. He didn't talk much, but when he held a rifle, he rarely missed. By his teenage years, he had become one of the best marksmen in the region. Yet no one believed he would become famous. He wasn't physically imposing. Standing only 5 feet 3 inches tall, he looked more like a small farm boy than a future warrior. But appearances can be deceiving, because what Simo lacked in size, he made up for in something far more powerful: patience. And patience in the frozen forests of Finland was the difference between
Now we go
life
to Chapter
and death.
2, Europe on the Edge of War. By the late 1930s, Europe had become a continent balanced on the edge of disaster. The First World War had ended only 2 decades earlier, but the fragile peace that followed was already beginning to crumble. Across Germany, Adolf Hitler had risen to power. His promises of restoring German strength and pride had transformed the nation into a rapidly expanding military force. One by one, neighboring territories began falling under Nazi control. Austria was annexed. Czechoslovakia was swallowed. Then, on September 1, 1939, German tanks rolled across the Polish border. World War II had begun. While most of Europe watched the growing conflict with fear, another powerful nation was quietly preparing its own plans: the Soviet Union. Under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, the Soviet government had been carefully studying the geography of Northern Europe. One country, in particular, worried them: Finland. A small nation with a dangerous location. Finland had gained independence from Russia only in 1917, following the Russian Revolution. For centuries before that, it had been ruled by larger empires, first Sweden, then Russia. Now, for the first time in its history, Finland was a young and independent nation. But its location made it vulnerable. The Finnish border lay dangerously close to Leningrad, one of the Soviet Union's most important cities. From Stalin's perspective, this was unacceptable. He feared that if another European power attacked the Soviet Union, Finland could become a launching point for invasion. So in 1939, Soviet diplomats approached Finland with a demand. They wanted Finnish territory near the border. In exchange, they offered land elsewhere. The proposal sounded reasonable on the surface, but the Finnish government understood the truth. If they agreed to Soviet demands now, more demands would follow. Eventually, Finland could lose its independence entirely. The answer from Helsinki was simple.
Now we go
No.
to Chapter 3, The Soviet Invasion. The morning of November 30th, 1939, began like many winter mornings in Finland, cold, quiet, and covered in fresh snow. Then the sky erupted. Soviet bombers roared across the border and began dropping bombs on Finnish cities, towns, and military positions. Helsinki, the capital, was one of the first targets. Explosions ripped through the streets as civilians scrambled for safety. At the same moment, thousands of Soviet troops began crossing the Finnish border along multiple fronts. Tanks rolled across frozen ground. Artillery units set up positions along roads and fields. Columns of soldiers marched forward with confidence. The Red Army believed this war would be short. Many Soviet officers predicted that Finland would collapse within 2 weeks. They had overwhelming numbers. They had tanks. They had aircraft. Finland had almost none of these advantages. But the Soviet commanders had made a fatal mistake. They believed that war would follow the same rules it had in other parts of Europe. They did not understand Finland. A war in the forest. Most of Finland is covered in dense forest. The trees grow close together, forming a natural maze of narrow paths and hidden clearings. For large military formations, these forests are a nightmare. Tanks cannot move freely. Vehicles become trapped in snow. And soldiers marching in tight formations become easy targets. The Finnish army understood this perfectly. Instead of confronting the Red Army head-on, Finnish commanders adopted a strategy that relied on speed, stealth, and surprise. Small groups of Finnish soldiers would move through the forests on skis. They could travel quickly and silently across the snow. They attacked Soviet supply lines. They ambushed isolated units. Then they vanished into the woods before the enemy could respond. To Soviet soldiers, it felt like fighting ghosts. But among these Finnish soldiers was someone even more dangerous, a hunter who hunted alone. A hunter returns to his element. For Simo Häyhä, the war felt strangely familiar. The forests where he now fought were the same forests where he had hunted animals as a boy. The same frozen lakes, the same silent hills. But now his prey was different. Instead of deer or foxes, he was hunting soldiers. Simo took his position before sunrise. He wore a white camouflage suit that blended perfectly with the snow. He moved slowly and carefully, ensuring that no branch snapped beneath his boots. Once he found the right location, he prepared his firing position. He packed snow firmly around the barrel of his rifle. Then he lay flat against the ground,
completely still, completely silent. He could remain in that position for hours, waiting, watching. The rifle. Simo Häyhä used a rifle called the Mosin Nagnant M2830. It was a Finnish modified version of the Russian Mosin Nagnant rifle. Reliable, accurate, simple. Unlike many snipers, Simo refused to use a telescopic scope. Most soldiers believed scopes were essential for long-distance shooting, but Simo had a different philosophy. Scopes reflected sunlight. They could give away a sniper's location. They also forced the shooter to raise their head slightly above cover. Iron sights kept his profile lower, and in the snowy forests, even the smallest advantage mattered.
Sniping is not about shooting. It is about waiting. A sniper may spend 10 hours lying in the snow for a single opportunity. Simo understood this better than anyone. The temperature that winter often dropped below -40 degrees Fahrenheit. At that level of cold, exposed skin freezes quickly. Metal weapons become painful to touch. Even breathing becomes difficult. But Simo endured it. He placed snow in his mouth to cool his breath. This prevented visible vapor from revealing his position. Then he watched and waited. The first patrol. One afternoon in early December, a Soviet patrol moved along a narrow forest road. There were about 8 soldiers. They walked cautiously, but not cautiously enough. They believed the Finnish army had retreated. They believed the forest was quiet. They were wrong. Simo had already been watching them for 20 minutes. He adjusted his rifle slightly. His breathing slowed. The front sight aligned with the first soldier's helmet. A single shot cracked through the frozen air. The soldier collapsed instantly. The patrol froze in confusion. They looked around. They saw no one. Before they could react, a second shot rang out. Another soldier fell. Panic spread through the group. They scattered into the forest. But scattering made them easier targets. One by one, Simo picked them off. When the forest finally grew silent again, the patrol was gone. 8 soldiers, 8 shots, 8 kills. Fear spreads. Stories travel quickly among soldiers. Within days, Soviet troops began hearing strange reports. Patrols were disappearing. Snipers were attacking from invisible positions. Some soldiers claimed the Finnish snipers were everywhere. Others believed they were facing an entire hidden army. But one description appeared again and again. A sniper dressed completely in white, silent, invisible, deadly. The Soviet soldiers gave him a name, Belaya Smert, the White Death. The kill count rises. Simo Häyhä did not keep track of his kills personally, but Finnish commanders did. They wanted to understand how effective their sniper units were. Each time Simo returned from a mission, the numbers were recorded. 10, 20, 50, then more. By late December 1939, his confirmed kills had already reached astonishing numbers. Some days he killed 20 soldiers, other days fewer, but the pattern remained consistent. The White Death Soviet
never stopped
countermeasures.
hunting.
Eventually, Soviet commanders realized that the stories about the White Death were not exaggerations. They were facing an exceptionally skilled sniper, and he was causing serious damage to their forces. The Red Army responded with several countermeasures. First, they sent counter-snipers, specially trained marksmen whose job was to hunt enemy snipers. These soldiers searched the forests carefully. They watched for movement. They studied likely sniper positions. But Simo was almost impossible to detect. His camouflage was perfect, his patience unmatched. Many Soviet countersnipers never saw him, but he saw them. Artillery fire. When snipers failed, Soviet commanders tried another tactic: artillery. They began bombarding areas where they believed Finnish snipers might be hiding. Shells exploded across the forest. Trees shattered. Snow and dirt flew into the air. Entire sections of woodland were destroyed. But the forests were vast, and Simo Häyhä never stayed in the same position for long. When artillery struck nearby, he simply moved, then resumed hunting. The manhunt. By early January 1940, the Soviet army had become obsessed with eliminating the White Death. They believed killing him would weaken Finnish morale. Search teams were deployed specifically to hunt him. Large patrols combed the forests. Snipers waited in ambush, but the hunter remained ahead of them. Because Simo Häyhä was not just a sniper, he was also a master of survival. He moved through the forests silently. He studied enemy movement. He anticipated their strategies. To the Soviet army, he seemed supernatural, a ghost that appeared only long enough to fire a shot, then vanished. A legend is born. As weeks passed, the White Death became a legend among Finnish soldiers. Stories spread about his incredible accuracy, about how he could remain hidden for an entire day, about how he could eliminate entire patrols alone. Some of the stories were exaggerated. War often produces myths, but the reality was already extraordinary. By early 1940, Simo Häyhä's confirmed sniper kills were approaching 500, a number that had never been seen before in modern warfare, and the war was not yet over. A dangerous target. For the Soviet Union, the existence of the White Death had become more than a military problem. It had become a matter of pride. The Red Army could not allow one sniper to humiliate an entire army. Orders were given. The White Death must be eliminated, no matter the cost. And soon, one Soviet sniper would finally succeed. But the bullet that struck Simo Häyhä would not end his story. It would
Now
only
we go
make it
to
more
Chapter
legendary.
4, The Birth of the White Death. By January of 1940, the Winter War had entered its most brutal phase. The Soviet Union had expected Finland to collapse quickly. Instead, the war had turned into a nightmare. Entire Soviet divisions were being slowed down by small groups of Finnish soldiers. Supply lines were constantly under attack. Patrols were vanishing in the forests. But one problem troubled the Soviet command more than anything else: the mysterious sniper their soldiers feared, the man they called the White Death. A war of patience. Sniping is not about firepower, it is about patience. Simo Häyhä understood something many soldiers never learn. The battlefield does not reward speed, it rewards stillness. For hours at a time, he would lie in the snow, barely moving. The cold seeped through his clothing. His fingers numbed against the rifle. But he waited, because eventually the enemy would make a mistake, and when they did, Simo was ready. The perfect position. One morning in January, Simo selected a small ridge overlooking a narrow forest road. Soviet soldiers often used the road to move supplies between units. The ridge provided an ideal vantage point. It allowed him to see movement from several hundred meters away, but it also offered natural cover. A cluster of snow-covered pine trees hid his silhouette. Simo carefully prepared his position. He packed snow around the front of his rifle to steady the barrel. He flattened the snow beneath his body. Then he lay down and waited. The column. Hours passed. Nothing moved in the forest. Then, sometime in the afternoon, he heard it. Boots, the sound of metal equipment rattling, voices speaking Russian. A Soviet column was approaching. Simo watched through his iron sights as the soldiers appeared on the road. There were at least 15 men, moving slowly through the trees. They seemed relaxed. They believed the area was safe. That belief would cost them dearly. The first shot. Simo adjusted his breathing, slow, controlled. His finger rested lightly on the trigger. The first soldier stepped into a clearing. The rifle cracked. The soldier collapsed instantly. The column froze. Men shouted. Some dove into the snow. Others scanned the trees desperately. But they saw nothing, because the sniper had already shifted slightly to a new angle. The second shot came seconds later. Another soldier fell.
Chaos
Panic
in the
erupted.
snow. The Soviet soldiers scattered into the forest, trying to find cover, but the forest itself worked against them. Every movement through the snow created noise. Every dark uniform stood out against the white ground. Simo moved his rifle calmly from target to target. Shot. Another soldier fell. Shot. Another. Within minutes, the column had disintegrated into chaos. Some soldiers attempted to run, others fired blindly into the trees, but the sniper remained invisible. The aftermath. When the shooting finally stopped, the forest returned to silence. The surviving Soviet soldiers had fled. Behind them lay several bodies scattered across the snow. Simo waited another 30 minutes before moving. This was another rule of sniping: never rush. There might still be enemy soldiers nearby. When he finally stood up, he inspected the battlefield. The results were devastating. A single sniper had destroyed an entire patrol. A growing reputation. Stories of encounters like this began spreading rapidly. Soviet soldiers whispered about the sniper who could kill an entire patrol alone. Some believed he had supernatural abilities. Others thought he was part of a secret Finnish sniper unit. But the truth was even shocking. The majority of these attacks were carried out by a single man, Simo Häyhä. The Soviet response. The Red Army could not ignore the problem any longer. Reports of the White Death had reached high-ranking Soviet commanders. They realized that this sniper was damaging morale. Soldiers were becoming afraid to enter the forests. Entire patrols hesitated to move without heavy support. So the Soviet command issued new orders. The White Death must be eliminated. Counter-snipers. The first solution was to deploy counter-snipers. These soldiers were trained to hunt enemy snipers. They studied terrain. They observed likely firing positions. They waited for the slightest movement. But Simo was extremely careful. He rarely stayed in one place for long. He changed positions constantly, and when he spotted a Soviet sniper searching for him, he usually fired first. Many Soviet counter-snipers died before they ever saw their opponent. Artillery barrages. When snipers failed, Soviet commanders turned to artillery. Entire sections of forest were bombarded with heavy shells. Explosions tore apart trees and blasted snow into the air. If the sniper was hiding in the area, the bombardment should kill him. But the tactic rarely worked. Simo understood the patterns of Soviet artillery. When he sensed danger, he moved quickly to a new location, then waited for the bombardment to end. Once the forest fell quiet again, the White Death returned. Hunting alone. Unlike many snipers, Simo often operated completely alone. He did not rely on spotters. He did not travel with a partner. This made him harder to detect. A single soldier leaves fewer tracks, creates less noise, and requires fewer supplies. But it also made his job more dangerous. If he was wounded or discovered, there would be no one nearby to help him. Still, Simo preferred it this way. He trusted his own instincts, and those instincts kept him alive. The kill count. By February 1940, the numbers were staggering. Official Finnish military records confirmed that Simo Häyhä had already killed over 500 Soviet soldiers with his rifle. In addition, he had killed many more using a submachine gun during close combat. All of this had happened in less than 100 days of fighting. No sniper in history had ever achieved such results. But the war was reaching a turning point. The Soviet Union was preparing a massive new offensive, and somewhere among those thousands of Soviet soldiers, a sniper was waiting, a sniper who would eventually find his mark. The shot that changed everything. On March 6, 1940, Simo Häyhä took his position in the snow as he had done countless times before. The forest was quiet, the air was bitterly cold, but somewhere in those trees another sniper had been watching, waiting. The bullet struck Simo in the face. The impact shattered his jaw and blew away part of his cheek. He collapsed into the snow. For the first time since the war began, the White Death had fallen. But even this would not be the end of his story, because Simo Häyhä was about to survive something
Now we
that
go to
should
Chapter
have killed
5.
him.
The Soviet Manhunt. By February 1940, the Winter War had become something the Soviet Union had never expected. What was supposed to be a quick invasion had turned into a humiliating struggle. Entire Soviet divisions were stalled in the frozen forests of Finland. Supply lines were constantly attacked, and Soviet soldiers had begun to fear the forests themselves. But above all, they feared one man, the sniper, known as the White Death. Panic in the Red Army. Reports about the White Death reached Soviet commanders almost daily. Patrols disappearing, snipers killed before they even fired a shot, entire units refusing to move without heavy support. At first, Soviet officers believed these reports were exaggerations. War often produces myths, but the numbers told a different story. Hundreds of soldiers had already been killed by a single sniper, and the number kept rising. The Red Army could no longer ignore the threat. Orders were issued across the front. The White Death must be eliminated. Special hunting teams. The Soviet command formed special hunting teams. These units consisted of experienced soldiers, scouts, and trained snipers. Their mission was simple: find the Finnish sniper, kill him. These teams spread through the forests, searching carefully for signs of his presence. They studied footprints in the snow. They examined possible sniper positions. They watched the trees for the smallest movement. But hunting Simo Häyhä was not easy, because he had spent his entire life in these forests. The master of camouflage. Simo understood that survival depended on invisibility. His white camouflage suit blended perfectly with the snowy landscape, but camouflage alone was not enough. He carefully chose his firing positions. Often he buried himself partially in the snow, leaving only his rifle exposed. From a distance, he looked nothing more than another mound of snow.
Even trained soldiers could walk within a few meters without noticing him. When the moment came, he fired, then disappeared again. A dangerous game. For Simo, the war had become a deadly game of patience. Every day he left his unit before sunrise. Every day he entered the forest alone. Every day he hunted. But he knew something important. The Soviet army was hunting him too. Every shot he fired increased the risk of being discovered. Every kill made him a bigger target. But Simo never rushed. He remained calm, focused, silent, and this discipline kept him alive. Counter-snipers in the trees. The Soviet army began deploying some of its best snipers to hunt the White Death. These men were highly trained. They knew the techniques of sniping. They understood how to track enemy shooters. But they were still outsiders in the Finnish forests. They were unfamiliar with the terrain, unfamiliar with the snow, and most importantly, unfamiliar with Simo Häyhä. Many Soviet snipers took positions in the trees, believing it would give them a better view of the forest. But climbing trees created movement, and movement is exactly what a sniper watches for. On several occasions, Simo spotted Soviet snipers hiding above him. Each time, he reacted the same way. A single shot, and another hunter
Artillery
became
and
the hunted.
bombardment. When sniper teams failed, Soviet commanders turned to heavier solutions, artillery. Entire areas of forest suspected of hiding the White Death were bombarded with shells. Explosions shattered trees, snow exploded into the air, the ground shook beneath the blasts. The Soviets hoped the bombardments would kill the sniper, or at least force him to retreat. But Simo rarely stayed in one location long enough to be caught. He moved constantly, always searching for new vantage points, always staying ahead of the hunt. A reputation that terrified soldiers. As the weeks passed, the legend of the White Death grew. Soviet soldiers began sharing stories about him. Some claimed he could see through trees. Others believed he could disappear into the snow itself. Some even said he was not human. Of course, none of these stories were true, but fear is powerful, and fear spreads quickly in war. Soon, entire Soviet patrols began moving cautiously through the forest. Some refused to move at all. They feared the single shot that could come from anywhere. The numbers grew. Meanwhile, the official Finnish records continued to track Simo's kills. The numbers were astonishing. 400, then 450, then more. Each confirmed kill added to his reputation. By early March 1940, Simo Häyhä had already achieved something no sniper in history had ever done, over 500 confirmed sniper kills, and he had done it in less than 3 months. The world had never seen anything like it. The Soviet determination. For the Soviet Union, the existence of the White Death had become a serious embarrassment. A single soldier was humiliating one of the largest armies on Earth. And worse, the stories about him were spreading beyond the battlefield. The Red Army could not allow the legend to continue. So new orders were given. The White Death must be killed, no matter what it takes. The final hunt. Soviet commanders began concentrating their efforts in areas where Simo had been most active. Snipers were placed in likely positions, artillery units prepared to fire at a moment's notice. Scouting patrols swept through the forests. Somewhere in those woods, they believed, the White Death was waiting, and this time they would be ready. The fatal day. On March 6, 1940, Simo Häyhä once again entered the forest before sunrise. The snow was deep, the air was painfully cold, but Simo had experienced these conditions many times before. He moved carefully to his chosen position, prepared his rifle, and began watching the forest. But this time, something was different. Somewhere nearby, another sniper was watching him, waiting. Patient,
just like he was. And within minutes, a single bullet would change Simo Häyhä's
Now
life
we go to
forever.
Chapter 6, The Bullet That Nearly Ended the White Death. By early March 1940, the Winter War had been raging for more than 3 months. The frozen forests of Finland had witnessed countless battles. Thousands of soldiers had died in the snow. And somewhere among those trees, one man had become a legend, the sniper the Soviet army called the White Death. But legends rarely last forever. Eventually, every hunter faces another hunter, and on March 6, 1940, Simo Häyhä would finally meet his. A quiet morning. That morning began like many others during the war. The forest was silent. Snow covered every branch and every stone. The temperature hovered far below freezing. Simo moved carefully through the trees, searching for a suitable firing position. He had spent months doing exactly this. It had become routine. Find a good vantage point, prepare the rifle, wait. But this morning would not be routine, because somewhere in that forest, another sniper had already taken position. The waiting game. Snipers understand patience better than most soldiers. Sometimes the battle between two snipers becomes a contest of endurance. Who can remain still the longest? Who can spot the other first? Simo carefully prepared his firing position on a small snow-covered slope. He packed snow around the front of his rifle to steady the barrel. Then he lay flat against the ground. His white camouflage suit blended perfectly with the snow. From even a short distance away, he would be nearly impossible to see. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing moved. The forest remained silent, but the silence was deceptive because the enemy sniper was also waiting, watching, studying. The moment of discovery. No one knows exactly what happened in the moments before the shot. Historians have reconstructed the event from battlefield reports and later testimony. It is believed that a Soviet sniper had been observing the same area. Perhaps he had followed Simo's tracks. Perhaps he had spotted a small movement in the snow. Or perhaps it was simply luck. But at some point, the Soviet sniper identified his target, and he fired. The shot. The bullet struck Simo Häyhä in the face. It was an explosive round. The impact was devastating. The left side of his jaw was shattered. Part of his cheek was torn away. The force of the shot threw him backward into the snow. For a moment, the forest fell silent again. The White Death had been struck. A body in the snow. When Finnish soldiers later described the scene, they said the injury looked impossible to survive. Blood covered the snow. Simo lay motionless. His face was horribly damaged. Most soldiers who saw him believed he was already dead. But one man noticed something, a small movement, a faint sign of life. Simo Häyhä was still breathing.
Several Finnish soldiers quickly rushed to his position. Enemy fire still threatened the area, but they knew they had to move fast. Carefully, they lifted Simo's body from the snow. His injuries were severe. His face was almost unrecognizable, but he was alive. They placed him on a sled and began transporting him toward the rear lines. The journey was slow and dangerous, but eventually they reached a field hospital. Doctors immediately began emergency treatment. Even then, survival seemed unlikely. The coma. Simo Häyhä slipped into a coma. His injuries were catastrophic. His jaw was destroyed. Bone fragments and tissue damage covered much of the left side of his face. Doctors were unsure whether he would live. Even if he survived, they believed he might never fully recover.
For days he remained unconscious. The White Death, the sniper who had terrified an entire army, lay silent in a hospital bed. Outside the hospital walls, the war continued. The end of the Winter War. Meanwhile, the situation on the battlefield had begun to change. The Soviet Union had reinforced its armies with massive numbers of troops and equipment. Despite their earlier failures, the Red Army slowly began pushing deeper into Finnish territory. Finland had fought bravely, but the country was exhausted. Supplies were running low. Casualties were mounting. Eventually, Finnish leaders realized they could not continue the war indefinitely. Peace negotiations began, and on March 13, 1940, the Winter War officially ended. Finland was forced to surrender some territory to the Soviet Union, but they had achieved something remarkable. They had defended their independence against a far larger enemy. Awakening. On the same day the war ended, something extraordinary happened in the hospital. After days in a coma, Simo Häyhä regained consciousness. Doctors were astonished. Many had believed he would never wake up. But the White Death had survived. His recovery would take months, and the injuries to his face would remain visible for the rest of his life. But he was alive. And in many ways, that survival made his story even more remarkable. The legend grows. By the time Simo recovered, his story had already spread throughout Finland. Newspapers reported his incredible achievements. Soldiers spoke of him with admiration. The sniper who had killed more than 500 enemy soldiers. The man the Soviet army had feared more than any other. The quiet farmer who had become a legend. But despite all the attention, Simo Häyhä remained humble. He never bragged about his kills. He never sought fame. When asked about his success, he simply gave a short answer: practice. A record that still stands. Today, historians still recognize Simo Häyhä as the deadliest sniper in military history. His confirmed sniper kills during the Winter War remain unmatched, and he achieved them all in less than 100 days of combat. But perhaps the most remarkable part of his story is not the number of enemies he killed. It is the fact that he survived. The bullet that should have ended his life instead became the final chapter in a legend that continues to inspire soldiers and historians around the world.
Now we go to Chapter 7, Recovery and the Man Behind the Legend. When Simo Häyhä finally opened his eyes in the hospital, the war was already over. For days he had been unconscious, lying between life and death. Doctors had not expected him to survive. The bullet that struck him had shattered the left side of his face. His jaw had been destroyed, and much of his cheekbone had been blown apart. To many soldiers who saw him on the battlefield, it had looked like a fatal wound. Yet somehow he lived. For weeks after waking, Simo could barely speak. Eating was extremely difficult. His injuries required multiple surgeries and months of careful medical treatment. But survival had always been part of who he was. The same determination that allowed him to endure freezing temperatures in the forest now pushed him through the long recovery process. A nation's hero. While Simo slowly healed, the people of Finland were learning about his achievements. The Winter War had shocked the world. Finland had fought bravely against a vastly larger Soviet army. Although Finland was forced to surrender some territory in the peace treaty, the country had preserved its independence. Many soldiers became heroes during the conflict, but one name stood above the rest: Simo Häyhä, the quiet farmer who had become the deadliest sniper in history, the sniper who had killed more than 500 Soviet soldiers, the man the Red Army had called the White Death.
Recognition from the Finnish army. Before the war ended, Simo had already been promoted several times for his extraordinary service. Eventually, he was promoted to the rank of second lieutenant. This was a remarkable achievement for someone who had started the war as a simple soldier. His commanders recognized not only his skill, but also his discipline. Simo had never acted recklessly. He had never sought glory. He had simply done his duty. The long road to healing. Despite surviving the war, Simo's injuries left permanent scars. The left side of his face was severely disfigured. His jaw required extensive reconstruction. For a long time, he had difficulty speaking clearly. But even these injuries did not break his spirit. Month after month, he worked through his recovery. Doctors and nurses were impressed by his quiet determination. Unlike many patients with severe injuries, Simo rarely complained. He simply focused on healing, step by step, day by day. Returning to civilian life. After his recovery, Simo returned to the countryside he had always loved. The forests of Finland had shaped his entire life. They had taught him patience, they had taught him survival, and they had become the battlefield where he made history. Now those same forests welcomed him back in peace. Simo returned to farming. He also continued hunting, something he had loved since childhood. Despite his fame, he preferred a quiet life. He avoided the spotlight. He rarely spoke publicly about the war. For him, the war had simply been a duty, a responsibility to defend his homeland. A humble man. Many journalists and historians later tried to interview Simo Häyhä. They wanted to understand the secret behind his incredible accuracy. How could one sniper achieve such results? Did he possess extraordinary natural talent? Did he follow special techniques? When asked these questions, Simo usually gave simple answers. Once, a reporter asked him what made him such a successful sniper. Simo thought for a moment. Then he replied with a single word: practice. That was all he said.
Legacy. Although Simo avoided fame, his reputation continued to grow. Military historians studied his tactics. Snipers around the world examined his techniques. His methods of camouflage, patience, and discipline became lessons for future generations. Even modern sniper training programs still refer to his achievements. Because what Simo accomplished during the Winter War remains unmatched. More than 500 confirmed sniper kills, achieved in less than 100 days of combat. A record that still stands today. The White Death lives on. As decades passed, the story of the White Death became part of military history. Soldiers told the story to new recruits. Historians wrote books about his exploits. Documentaries explored his incredible achievements. Yet the man himself remained unchanged. Simo Häyhä lived a quiet life in Finland. He enjoyed hunting, he cared for his farm, and he stayed far away from the fame that followed his name. The final years. Simo Häyhä lived a long life after the war. In fact, he lived far longer than anyone expected after his near-fatal injury. He eventually reached the age of 96. When he passed away in 2002, Finland lost one of its most extraordinary soldiers. But his legacy remained. Because the story of the White Death is not just about war. It is about resilience, about patience, about the quiet strength of someone who refused to give up. The man, not the myth. Today, when historians talk about Simo Häyhä, they often focus on the numbers,
the 500 kills, the record-breaking accuracy, the fear he inspired in the Soviet army. But those numbers tell only part of the story. Behind the legend was a simple man, a farmer, a hunter, a quiet soldier who believed he was only defending his home. And perhaps that is what makes his story so remarkable, because sometimes the greatest legends are created not by heroes seeking glory, but by ordinary people doing
Now we
what
go
they
to
believe
final
is
chapter
right.
8, The Legacy of the White Death. When the Winter War ended in March 1940, Europe remained trapped in the chaos of World War II. Across the continent, armies continued to fight massive battles. Millions of soldiers would eventually lose their lives before the war finally ended. But among all the stories of World War II, one story stood out as something almost unbelievable. The story of a quiet Finnish farmer who had fought an entire army and won. A record that still stands. Historians studying the Winter War eventually confirmed something extraordinary. During less than 100 days of combat, Simo Häyhä had achieved more than 500 confirmed sniper kills. Many historians believe the true number may have been even higher. In addition to his sniper kills, Simo also killed dozens of enemy soldiers using a Suomi submachine gun during close combat. Altogether, his total combat record may have exceeded 700 enemy soldiers. Even today, no sniper in military history has officially surpassed his confirmed record. More than 80 years later, Simo Häyhä is still recognized as the deadliest sniper who ever lived. Lessons for future generations. Military academies around the world began studying the tactics used by the White Death. What made him so effective? The answer was not complicated equipment. It was discipline, patience, and understanding the battlefield. Simo relied on simple but brilliant techniques. White camouflage to blend into the snow. Iron sights to avoid light reflection from scopes. Snow packed around the rifle to stabilize the shot. Snow placed in his mouth to hide breathing vapor. Each detail improved his survival. Each decision made him harder to detect. Together, these techniques allowed him to dominate the battlefield. A psychological weapon. But Simo Häyhä's impact was not only physical, it was psychological. The fear he created among Soviet soldiers was enormous. Entire patrols hesitated to move through certain forests. Some soldiers refused to advance without artillery support. Even experienced troops feared becoming the next victim of the unseen sniper. In war, fear can be as powerful as bullets, and the legend of the White Death became one of the most powerful psychological weapons of the Winter War.
Despite his incredible record, Simo never celebrated killing. Those who knew him after the war said he rarely talked about the battles. When he did, he spoke about the war in a calm and simple way. For him, it had never been about glory. It had been about defending Finland. His country had been invaded, his home had been threatened, and he had done what he believed was necessary. A quiet life. After recovering from his injuries, Simo returned to a peaceful life in Finland. He lived in the countryside, he farmed the land, and he continued to hunt in the forests he loved. Visitors who met him were often surprised. They expected to meet a fearsome warrior. Instead, they met a quiet, modest man, a man who rarely spoke about his achievements. The question everyone asked. Over the years, many journalists asked Simo the same question. How did you become the deadliest sniper in history?
They expected a complicated answer, some secret technique, some hidden skill. But Simo's response was always the same. He would shrug slightly and say, "Practice." That simple word captured the essence of who he was: discipline, patience, dedication. The final years. Simo Häyhä lived an unusually long life for a soldier who had faced so much danger. He survived a devastating battlefield injury. He survived one of the coldest wars in modern history. And he survived long enough to see the world change dramatically. He passed away in 2002 at the age of 96. By then, he had become a legend not only in Finland, but around the world. Why his story still matters. The story of Simo Häyhä continues to fascinate historians and military experts, not because of the violence of war, but because of what his story represents. A reminder that determination and discipline can overcome overwhelming odds. A reminder that even a single individual can change the course of events. And perhaps most importantly, a reminder that sometimes the greatest warriors are the ones who never seek fame. The White Death. In the frozen forests of Finland during the winter of 1939 and 1940, one man became a nightmare for an invading army. A sniper dressed in white, silent, invisible, patient. The soldiers of the Red Army gave him a name they would never forget: the White Death. And more than 80 years later, the legend of Simo Häyhä still lives on.